Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. Welcome to the link between domestic violence, child abuse, cancer, and heart disease. My name is Hannah Craig, and I'm the Director of Content for domesticshelters.org, subbing in today for our National Director, Ashley Rumschlag, who's out of the office. With me today, handling things in the back end and in our chat, is our amazing Senior Digital Service Specialist, Rachel Myers. We are domesticshelters.org, and today's presentation is part of our monthly free webinar series. You can check out the Watch Webinars section of domesticshelters.org to see more of our past webinars, and once you've watched them, you can still even receive a certificate of attendance. DomesticShelters.org is a program of Alliance for Hope International where we focus on creating communities of safety, hope, and healing. You can check out allianceforhope.org, our brand new website, to learn more about the Alliance's other programs and access just a huge library of professional resources available to you mostly for free. Today, we do have live closed captions available. To enable them, you can just click the Show Captions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We are also in listen only mode today as a webinar. So please use the Q&A box also at the bottom of your Zoom screen to ask any questions for the presenters. Using the Q&A box instead of the chat really helps us get that information to the presenters. We can help them see your questions easier. And please feel free to use the chat, as you guys already are, to connect with other attendees and discuss the presentation. Um, Email to you within 1 week, and this is our number one question, is always, yes, you will have everything emailed to you. You will receive a certificate of attendance. You'll get a transcript of the presentation. You will get I believe you'll get the slide deck. You'll get a recording and any additional resources as well as links that we put in the chat. And really, once again, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us for the link between domestic violence, child abuse, cancer, and heart disease. Today, we are just so honored to have Barry Goldstein and Veronica York presenting for us. Barry is just an absolutely wonderful friend of domesticshelters.org and is a member of our editorial advisory group. Barry is a domestic violence author, speaker, and advocate, an expert witness who has worked in the DV movement for 42 years with a focus on the broken custody court system, as well as serving as an instructor for a batterers program for 21 years. Barry is the author of 6 books, and his new book, Preventing Domestic Violence and Child Abuse, Medical, Law Enforcement, Judicial, and Human Benefits, co-edited with Mo Therese Hanna and Veronica York, will be published very soon. He is also the author of the Safe Child Act, a comprehensive plan to help solve the custody court problem. Barry is a partner at Goldstein and York and has been qualified as an expert witness in 31 states. Also presenting with us today is Veronica York, the absolutely brilliant Veronica York. Veronica is a dedicated domestic violence author, speaker, and expert. As a partner at Goldstein and York, she serves as an expert witness in child custody cases involving allegations of domestic abuse and child abuse. She is currently qualified as an expert witness in 10 different states. Veronica is also the co-owner of York Consulting and Family Services and provides services as a certified high conflict divorce coach and family law mediator. As a survivor of domestic violence, Veronica deeply understands the challenges posed by the family court system's harmful response to DV custody cases, and she is just absolutely passionate for systemic change, including improved training and education for court professionals on domestic violence and its impact. And I will ask Veronica and Barry to please turn on their video and audio and join us to get going today. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
And just bear with us for 1 minute while we get those slides up on the screen. Thank you. There we go.
Okay, can you see the first slide?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I am Veronica York, and we want to welcome everyone today. It was really great to see everyone introduce themselves. We're excited about presenting this information to you today. And it's one of 3 webinars that we're doing for domesticshelters.org. They will be starting today. Presentation is going to be about family court practices and how they are increasing our rates of domestic violence homicides. And by the way, all three presentations we're doing are based off of the research that we've done for our upcoming book that should be published hopefully by the end of this year. And we're really excited about the research that we've done for this book because we really believe it's going to be helpful for protective mothers who are in child custody battles in the family court system. So, again, next week will be about how making this clearer to courts can help change their approach and be more willing to listen to domestic violence experts. Again, because their current court practices are increasing our rates of domestic violence homicide instead of decreasing, is what we want, right? It will also talk about how society can help to do something about the court's problems that we're having and not make it just a problem for protective mothers and protective fathers, but for society as a whole, for them to understand what's really going on. And then also, we'll talk about how abusers are very successful in manipulating courts, and therefore, this is helping and increasing our domestic violence homicides. The third presentation we'll do, which is 2 weeks from today, is going to focus on the very high cost that we have as a society for tolerating things like domestic violence and child abuse. And I'm not talking just about the physical costs, but also the financial costs. We really need courts to help society by stopping abusers from manipulating the court system. We could save $3.6 trillion if we prevent domestic violence with better practices in family court systems. That equates to $11,000 per person in our country. So we certainly want to talk about those benefits and how we can prevent that. But today we are talking about the link between domestic violence, child abuse, cancer, and heart disease. We're really excited because we have been working with the American Heart Association and the American Cancer Society on this research. And we are going to be talking about how domestic violence prevention can really save millions of lives and trillions of dollars. So I will let Barry start us off on the next slide. He is actually going to start with a very personal story of his. And so we'll get started on that.
Okay, welcome everybody. Fundamentally, what our book is about is the similarities between the 1964 Surgeon General's report that linked cancer and smoking with the ACE studies that show the harm from domestic violence and child abuse. And the idea is that just as society came together to reduce smoking, we can come together to reduce domestic violence and child abuse, and that the benefits are going to be similar. And we think, as we've gone through the research about the movement to prevent smoking, we've seen that what they had to overcome was much greater than what we would have to do to prevent domestic violence and child abuse. If you think about it, they could not ban smoking for the same reasons that prohibition didn't work. And so they had to find other ways to discourage smoking. The fact that domestic violence and child abuse is illegal should make it easier to enforce. Similarly, it often seems overwhelming that we have to deal with the fathers' rights movement and the cottage industry. They seem powerful, but if you compare it with the tobacco companies, they're much less powerful. The tobacco companies were wealthier and stronger and more influential. And what's interesting is the court cases. For decades, tobacco companies never lost the case because they could use their superior resources to fight all those cases. Even today, as we deal with domestic violence and child abuse in the biased custody courts, when we get an attorney willing to promote this information and a judge willing to listen, as expert witnesses, we can save children. We do save children. So we're in a stronger position starting than those working to prevent smoking. And the point of the picture here and this screen is that the success of the anti-smoking movement led to millions of stories of success that changed lives in such memorable ways. And what we're saying is we can do the same thing for domestic violence and child abuse. Today, we know millions of stories of courts failing to protect mothers and children and the disastrous consequences. But the stories about anti-smoking are good stories that improve people's lives. And you're seeing here a picture of myself and my mother. And when I was in college, I asked for a very special gift. I asked my mom to stop smoking, and she gave me that gift. And there is no question that she lived many additional years because she stopped smoking. And to do some calculations, when someone is 83 years and 4 months, that's 1,000 months. And towards the end of my mom's life, we had this wonderful birthday party to celebrate her 1,000th birthday. And she always remembered it. It was the last big celebration in her life, but it was something really meaningful to her. And so it's the kind of thing that we can have when we do the right things to change smoking or in the future to change domestic violence and child abuse. Next. So we want to look at what we've learned about the movement to prevent smoking. And what happened up until the start of the 20th century, lung cancer was rare. And what happened was there were improvements in manufacturing so that they could mass produce cigarettes. And at the same time, they were able to do massive advertising to create a need for their product. And the early research, particularly in the 1940s and 50s, started to see for the first time a large increase in particularly lung cancer. And that is what created the concern, particularly, for instance, the Cancer Society. And we want to emphasize not all cancer is caused by smoking, is caused by domestic violence and child abuse. But reducing smoking very significantly reduced cancer and heart disease, and we can do the same thing by reducing domestic violence and child abuse. And it's significant that in our family courts, they're not even thinking about the connection between their tolerance of domestic violence and child abuse and the increased risk of children for cancer and heart disease. As a child, one of my heroes was President Kennedy. And in doing the research for this book, I learned something about him that I never knew, even though I've read dozens of books about him. In 1961, the Cancer Society and a couple of other health organizations sent a letter to President Kennedy telling him about the research link between cancer and smoking. And he used that to create the Surgeon General's committee to investigate. And that led to the 1964 Surgeon General's report that explained the risks. And that in turn led to the movement where all different parts of society came together to dramatically reduce smoking. Veronica?
Okay, so I'm going to talk about what we did back in 1964 with the Surgeon General's report as a society, um, and the public health campaign that was led by the American Cancer Society, the American Heart Association, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So at that time, um, they lobbied for taxes on cigarettes, and that did a lot to help increase revenue, while discouraging smoking, particularly discouraging smoking to young people, to youth. Obviously, youth has less financial resources, they're more impressionable. Obviously, it's harder to stop smoking once you've started. So, a lot of efforts were made to detour youth from starting in the first place, which makes sense. Also, there were a lot of lawsuits, as Barry mentioned earlier, against big tobacco, and they were suing big tobacco for things like product liability, negligent advertising, fraud, violation for consumer protection laws, things like that. And of course, big tobacco used very aggressive litigation tactics. And a lot of the times, those cases were dismissed because big tobacco had a lot of financial resources. It wasn't until about 40 states came together in November of 1988 with a class action lawsuit, that big tobacco actually started, they settled out of courts. And what that did was it made it to where they could not do TV and radio ads, especially TV and radio ads that were geared towards encouraging children to smoke. And as part of that settlement, they had to pay over $206 billion over 25 years, which helped create the National Public Education Foundation, which was designed to also prevent youth from smoking and prevent them from getting related diseases from smoking. One of the things we wanted to do today is show you a commercial from that time period that was used to help detour smoking at that time. And I think once you watch the commercial, you'll understand why we picked this particular one.
Like father, like son. Like father, like son. Think about it.
For information on smoking and heart disease, ask your heart association.
So that gives you kind of an idea of the types of information they were putting out to the public to help detour smoking. And, from efforts like that and from efforts from society, there ended up being big restrictions on smoking. And if you think about it, today we are very used to, and it's very normal to not be able to smoke in an airplane or in a public space or in a restaurant or even a bar. At that time, it was extremely rare for that to happen, and so they were putting restrictions on where you can smoke and in public places. We understood that even secondhand smoke was very dangerous for other people. And we believe that we can do some of these same things for domestic violence and child abuse. And as Barry mentioned earlier, this didn't make smoking illegal. Um, and if you think about it, domestic violence is supposed to be legal. I mean, illegal. So we can use these types of societal pressures to help, mostly for education and just to get the public awareness out there. Because I think a lot of times, if you haven't experienced it yourself or don't know someone who has, it's very hard to understand. Um, and again, Barry mentioned that, the cottage industry of professionals who push things like alienation theories and fathers' rights groups seem to be very powerful when it comes to domestic violence and child abuse. But tobacco companies were really powerful at that time too. So if society creates campaigns the way we did with smoking, we can prevent consequences from domestic violence and child abuse. And I'll just add now, if you I actually just saw a commercial last night from the CDC about smoking prevention, and instead of prevention, it was more focused on the consequences. So if you smoke for long periods of time, this is what you can expect. There was someone with a trachea who couldn't breathe, lots of diseases that were developed. So they're trying to use consequences for smoking as a way to deter smoking as well. So I'll let Barry take the next slide.
Okay, so the anti-smoking efforts have been hugely successful. And, I think we tend to minimize it because we're used to it. But it wasn't inevitable. And the fact that we could do this tells us we can do the same thing to prevent domestic violence and child abuse. So one of the results has been a substantial decline in smoking rates. In 1965, 42% of adults in this country were smokers. By 2013, that was down to 18%. And that's a huge benefit. In 2014, which was the 50th anniversary of the Surgeon General's report, experts calculated that we had saved over 8 million lives because of the results of the anti-smoking campaign. And in return, that saves trillions of dollars in healthcare and other costs avoided. In other words, all of our lives, smokers and non-smokers, are hugely benefited because of the success in preventing smoking. And again, we keep emphasizing we can do the same thing when it comes to domestic violence and child abuse. Next.
I'm going to talk about the consequences from exposure to adverse childhood experiences. Adverse childhood experiences is a study done out of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It is a study that talks about the impact of domestic violence and child abuse on children, particularly children who are going through trauma that can be associated with child custody cases, etc., being exposed to abuse, the stress and fear that abusers cause. When we talk about ACEs, there are actually 10 adverse childhood experiences, and for each ACE that a child is exposed to, they get a score of 1. So they could have a score between 0 and 10. The 10 ACEs are physical abuse, sexual abuse, or emotional abuse, physical neglect or emotional neglect, domestic violence, the separation of parents, the exposure to substance abuse, exposure to mental illness, and the death or incarceration of a parent. So again, for each ACE, a child gets a score of 1. So for context, a child with a score of 6 or more ACEs on average would lose 20 years off of their life. So some other consequences from ACEs can include increased risk of stress, anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, suicide, especially later in life. When people are stressed out, it leads to toxic stress. I mean, if you go to the doctor because you're having heart problems, the first thing the doctor is going to tell you is to reduce your stress. And that stress can cause things like cancer, again, heart disease, have mental health issues. And, when we're stressed, we tend to make poor decisions. We can turn to things like drugs or alcohol, promiscuity, running away from home, things that are detrimental to ourselves, just to kind of alleviate what we're feeling and the stress that we're feeling. So ACEs is extremely important. It's something that Barry and I use every time we testify in court about the impact of domestic violence on children. And the last thing I'll say about this is that the impact of smoking usually happens later in life. But when children are exposed to ACEs, the impacts can be immediate and they can be severe immediately, which really keeps them from reaching their true potential unless they're protected. And obviously makes them much more likely to die from things like murder and suicide. So ACEs is something we truly want to have people understand and educate people about, particularly family courts and judges. Okay. Barry?
Okay, so it's not immediately obvious how a father yelling at a mother is going to cause cancer or heart disease. And in fact, that's not always the case. But when that yelling is part of a broader pattern of coercive and controlling behavior, it adds to the fear and stress that is going to ruin children's lives. That's what they're missing. So stress um, creates inflammation in our hearts, which weakens our hearts, make us more vulnerable. The stress also obviously creates high blood pressure. And the other thing that we've already been talking about is that um, exposure to domestic violence and child abuse encourages smoking. And we know that adds to domestic violence and child abuse. 55% of the smokers in this country started smoking because of their high ACE score. So there's that direct connection with heart disease and also cancer. The other part is that stress weakens our immune system, and that's why cancer is more likely for children exposed to domestic violence and child abuse. And again, custody courts are making decisions that are supposed to be about the well-being of children without even considering the very real risk of cancer and heart disease. Next.
So how do we avoid these horrible consequences from ACEs? When Barry was writing his Quincy Solution book, he actually interviewed medical doctors who were working on the ACE research. And he asked them this very important question. He asked them, what can we do now to save children from the horrible consequences of ACEs? And the doctors gave us some good news. They said there are 2 things that we can do to help reduce the impact of domestic violence, child abuse, and other trauma on children, and particularly children who are going through child custody issues. And what they said is, number 1, the children will need to have medical treatment and therapy as problems come up, and importantly, to reduce their fear and stress. And so what that means for family court is that the protective parent must have control over decision making for medical, psychological, things like that. Because we know from the Saunders study that abusive fathers will use decision making to block anything the mother wants, and particularly things like therapy and medical treatment, because they do not want their abuse to be exposed. So that's the first thing. The second thing the doctor said is that the children are going to need to be protected from further situations that are going to cause them fear and stress. And importantly, when we're looking at child custody cases, we want to make sure the protective parent has custody and that the abusive parent is limited to supervised visits if and until they can change their behaviors. Um, and of course, that sounds pretty obvious when you say it out loud, but when family courts are not using this information, they are minimizing the impact that this domestic violence and child abuse is having on these children. And they are believing, the myth that mothers frequently make false reports of abuse and things like that. So we want to make sure that we're helping these children to heal by decreasing their stress and fear and situations that cause them stress and fear, and by allowing them to get the medical treatment that they need. The American Heart Association recently put out a press release with new research they had back in January of 2024. And in that press release, they said that childhood relationships experiences may have good and bad effects on adult heart health. So we know that things that happen in their childhood can affect their heart health later. We also know, based on ACE and also based on the American Heart Association research, that having one nurturing parent is a protective factor for children who are exposed to domestic violence and child abuse. So we know that children don't need both parents equally. They need their safe parent more than their abusive one, and they need their protective parent more, and primary attachment figure more than the other parent. So when we're seeing fathers' rights groups pushing things like shared parenting and joint custody, those things are not appropriate in domestic violence cases. We also want to see children who are younger be involved in play therapy that is trauma informed. Those are best practices because play therapy is a really good place for children to play. They like going, it doesn't feel like therapy for them. And most importantly, they can express whatever they need to express through their play and their artwork. And in family court, that's important because it takes coaching off the table. It's a very common abuser tactic to claim that mom is coaching when the child refuses to go with dad. And so play therapy can kind of take that off the table because it's really hard to coach someone how to play with Legos or draw a picture. And a good play therapist can really help support that child and what they need to express through their play and artwork, particularly when they're younger. We need to provide safe and stable nurturing environments for these children. And we want the community, we want society to help hold abusers accountable for the actions that they're doing that are creating that stress and fear. Again, because reducing stress is the most important. And courts are knowingly or unknowingly really doing the opposite of that. They're increasing the stress because they don't understand what to focus on.
Okay, so the domestic violence movement has long promoted a coordinated community response. And if you think about it, that's exactly what we used to discourage smoking. And it was successful. And what we want to talk about is the path forward. And so we need a campaign to increase public awareness and education so people understand it's not just the direct victims that are harmed by domestic violence and child abuse. All of us pay a high price for tolerating domestic violence and child abuse. And the reason that that's important, The reason we talk about, for instance, the financial cost of domestic violence and child abuse is that we have been just talking about the human cost, and because that's the most important, but it hasn't succeeded. We think looking at the other consequences will make the policymakers more willing to make a priority of preventing domestic violence and child abuse. And that's what we're trying to do. We need professionals to be trained in trauma and ACEs so they can spread the information, because the role of doctors was really important in reducing smoking, and it really can be, particularly pediatricians, in reducing domestic violence and child abuse. And we need a unified response across sectors. I should share with you that the lead author of the ACE study, Dr. Vincent Felitti, and ACE is medical research, but he now says that the best use of his research is prevention, particularly in family court. And so we need the family court and law enforcement and health professionals, the religious community, media, educators, all to take a role in spreading the right message, because many of these organizations for a long time were giving the wrong message. And that's part of the change that we're promoting. Veronica?
So I'm going to talk a little bit about how custody courts are a critical barrier. They are hindering improvements in domestic violence and child abuse. And we have many organizations that are wonderful, just like domesticshelters.org. I see many people on this call who are advocates, who are doing this work every day to help victims of domestic violence, survivors of domestic violence, children of domestic violence. And there's a lot of great work being done. And a lot of times that work is undermined because family courts are not listening to us. They're not paying attention to the research. They refuse to look at the information. And even if they do, they just feel like they know better based on their own beliefs and biases. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've experienced. And because most of our work is done on behalf of protecting children from domestic violence and child abuse in family courts, we know that courts are doing things like ignoring the research, like ACE and Saunders. I haven't talked a lot about Saunders. I spoke about ACE, but Saunders was a study done out of the National Institute of Justice in the U.S. Justice Department. It is highly credible research. It was to assess the domestic violence knowledge of judges, lawyers, and particularly custody evaluators, because judges and lawyers get a lot of their information from custody evaluators, and often it's misinformation when there's domestic violence and child abuse, because mental health professionals are not typically experts in domestic violence. So Saunders found we need a multidisciplinary approach in these cases, and courts are not using that. Trust, bias, and unqualified professionals is what they're doing when they're not using the Saunders study. They're turning to the wrong professionals instead of looking at professionals who understand domestic violence and dynamics of domestic violence and how this impacts the children and the significance of behaviors that occur. As most of you know on this call, domestic violence is not just physical violence. It is much more than that, but courts tend to just focus on physical violence and then ignore everything else. They're enabling retaliation on protective mothers. So because they don't understand things about coercive control, they don't understand emotional abuse, psychological abuse, spiritual abuse, and things like that, they oftentimes will retaliate on mothers and even attorneys for mothers who try to bring forth evidence of abuse, and they will turn those things against them. And part of that is gender bias, but another part of that is just they don't understand it, so they just move on to things they're more familiar with. There is a very high misuse of high conflict and alienation type label on protective parents. Mostly when people are using high conflict type approaches, which can be using people like guardian ad litems or forcing shared parenting and joint custody when it's not appropriate, they're trying to create a false equivalency between an abuser and a victim. And when you are trying to force 50-50 custody when there's a victim and an abuser, there is not an equal balance of power there. So essentially, you're putting that abuser with all the power, because obviously, in 50-50 type situations, the victim will have to go along with anything the abuser wants or face consequences for that. So these high conflict approaches and alienation theories that essentially ignore all evidence of abuse are certainly barriers to helping victims and children of domestic violence in getting help and being able to heal. And courts often very much favor abusive fathers. A lot of that does have to do with a control. I mean, obviously, abuse is about control, and that does include financial control. So a lot of times, the financial resources are on the side of the abusive father, and um, they are able to hire lawyers that use very aggressive tactics and things like that. And that helps courts hear a lot of the misinformation rather than the information that they need to hear, which is Ace and Saunders, and things and research on gender bias and research on primary attachment figure and things like that. So these are very common barriers for protective parents going into child custody cases, that courts are doing, that are very much hindering the progress that we're making outside of custody courts with domestic violence and child abuse.
Okay, let's get a little more specific about what we need from the various parts of the community. With respect to law enforcement, we need them to prioritize domestic violence and child protection, to learn DV dynamics. What's particularly important is DV is very much underreported. When an abuser is first arrested or could be arrested, very often law enforcement wants to treat that as a first offense. But what we know is before he gets to physical abuse, he's probably committed hundreds or thousands of DV tactics. He probably wasn't arrested, or there wasn't a complaint made the first time he broke the law. So it's not a first offense. It's the one opportunity to change his behavior, to protect the children. And if they instead use leniency, or give them a chance to avoid a record and a finding, it loses the one chance, and they're missing that. When we were working on smoking, what happened was doctors would routinely ask, "Did you smoke?" They still do that today. We need health professionals to screen for ACEs. And some do ask you, are you a victim of domestic violence? We need trauma-informed care, and all health professionals should be familiar with ACE. For the religious community, instead of the focus on let's just keep the family together, we need them to support survivors and to challenge harmful norms. With abusers, they need to make them change, or else they're no good for the family. For the media, we need them to raise awareness, to use the correct language. Very often we'll see a DV homicide and they interview friends and family that say what a nice guy he is. They're not talking about or understanding that how he acts in public tells us nothing about how he acts in private. And that's a very common mistake in the custody courts. The media needs to promote evidence-based solutions, to help us with this. For educators, A lot of schools are using ACE because it's helpful. They often get students who were traumatized at home acting out, and it interferes with the education process. And what they've learned from ACE is not to ask what's wrong with the child, but what has been done to the child. And we need to be aware that children who are exposed to domestic violence and child abuse, they have trouble concentrating, they don't succeed in school, and it affects their entire life. Next.
Okay, so I know we've been trying to compare smoking, domestic violence, and how we can reduce that by using the same kind of practices we did for when we try to reduce smoking. So, benefits of treating domestic violence and child abuse, like we did with the smoking campaigns, is our children can have longer, healthier, safer, more successful lives if we can understand how to help them now when they have been exposed to things like domestic violence, child abuse, and trauma. In again, the things we mentioned earlier with the play therapy and reducing their stress and fear. Not only can we help our children live better lives, but we can reduce crime and violence. A lot of the mass shootings that are done by perpetrators of domestic violence. And if we can reduce domestic violence, we can actually reduce all crimes, because a lot of other crimes happen because of domestic violence. If you think about it, homicides, suicides, when we look at things again like mass shootings. And Bill Delahunt, who is the former Massachusetts DA and U.S. representative, he said that exact thing. He said that if we can reduce DV, we can reduce all crime. And he created the first ever prosecutorial unit on domestic violence and sexual assault cases. He was the one that was pretty much did the all of the really great reforms that happened in Quincy that Barry's book is about, that really helped reduce domestic violence homicides and domestic violence crimes back in the 1990s. So we know it can be done, but again, our next presentation will be about domestic violence homicides and how the numbers of domestic violence homicides have actually started to increase to the same numbers they were back in the 1970s. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that we are allowing so much domestic violence and child abuse to continue without any consequences or accountability to abusers.
Okay, there is a massive savings in public funds if we started taking DV and child abuse more seriously. A big part of that is health costs. Governments pay Medicaid, Medicare, they pay employees health insurance. So they're paying far more, and all taxpayers are paying because of the cost from domestic violence and child abuse. And that gets missed. And one of the things that I think is really important in understanding this is that when we fail to prevent domestic violence and child abuse, it means that many DV victims, children who witness domestic violence, abusers, third parties, do not reach their potential. They can't. And we're missing that. That is a huge break on our economy. And we sometimes have discussions about the fact that very often a younger generation isn't able to make the same resources and income as the older generation. And there are a variety of factors for that, but our tolerance of domestic violence and child abuse is a huge part of that. If we were to do the kinds of things for DV and child abuse that we did for smoking, there would be a huge increase in everyone's wealth. not just victims, not just the wealthy, everyone would benefit. And that's not our main focus, but what's important about it is that can be the incentive to make the changes that are needed. And if I can make one last point before we take questions, the custody courts are a huge roadblock to solving this problem. Abusive fathers have been really successful in the tactic of using custody courts to regain what they think is their right to control their victims. As long as the custody courts are making it harder for women to escape their abusers, it's going to be hard to make any kind of progress. And but the other side of it is if we understand how much harm the custody courts are doing, not just to the individuals in front of the court, but to all of us, that can create the pressure needed to get the changes that we want. And so I want to share that because we think that the domestic violence movement, and most of you were part of the domestic violence movement, need to make changing child custody a really high priority. And so we appreciate your interest and we're happy to answer any questions.
Hi, Veronica and Barry, thank you so much. That was absolutely just chock full of incredibly helpful information. And we have got actually a really good amount of questions about that information. So I'm going to dive right in. And I think this is, for me, like kind of one of the biggest questions that lingers after this is what can we do to make those changes? What can we do to help spread the information to start making changes to fight domestic violence and address domestic violence similarly to the fight against big tobacco?
If I could start with one thing, as Veronica mentioned, we interviewed representatives from the Cancer Society and the Heart Association. And they have the same research that we have. They agree that exposure to domestic violence and child abuse causes cancer and heart disease. And part of what we're trying to do is to get the Cancer Society and the Heart Association to take a larger role in preventing domestic violence and child abuse. Because if we go to the legislature and ask for needed reforms, and the Cancer Society and the Heart Association are supporting us, we're going to have a much easier time because they are so well respected. And what they told us is for local people to reach out to the local offices, the Cancer Society and the Heart Association, ask them to take a larger role. And we think that's helpful. And in the DV movement, we have organizations all over the country. So we're in a particularly good position to contact our local Cancer and Heart Association offices and try to encourage them to do that. And they already have the research, so we can do that. And the other part, one of the reasons we've developed this is when we testify, for us to be able to say, it's not just our research, the Cancer Society and the Heart Association agree with us. That's, I think, persuasive for anyone who is capable of being persuaded. So that's part of it. And again, I want to encourage the DV community to make child custody, a priority, because as long as the custody courts keep abusers interacting with their victims, we're not going to make much progress. And we have to help to protect the mothers. Next week, we're going to talk about the research that shows that the DV homicide rate is rising specifically because the custody courts are failing. The custody courts don't understand the fundamental nature of the cases that they're dealing with. They're not high conflict. They're not equal protection kind of things. They're the worst abusers seeking to regain control so they can hurt the mother and children, and the courts don't get that.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I do just want to remind everyone about next week's webinar that Barry just mentioned. I have a very strong feeling we'll delve a lot, obviously, more deeply into this topic. But just following up on that, if you could briefly talk a little bit about what steps can be taken by individuals, by advocates working in their community to help make those changes in the custody court to address some of those issues, to push for what we need.
Veronica, you want to do it?
Okay, I was just waiting. Sure. So, you know, being in the front lines, being on the forefront, I think it's really about having those conversations about these hard issues because, you know, mothers are afraid to report their abuse in custody courts. They do get a lot of support and help with shelters, with advocates, and people like that. But then when they're trying to save their children, they're running into a lot of roadblocks. And so having these discussions about needing a multidisciplinary approach in their cases is going to be really helpful because it's hard for mothers to find attorneys that are going to advocate for them and fight for them because a lot of times even attorneys are scared to present the information for fear of retaliation against them and their future cases with these judges. And so I think just making it more popular for victims to have advocates with them, to have experts like Barry and myself with them to maybe even testify at their case, and helping courts make it more of a uh, normal thing because we run into a lot of it as being, you know, most judges have never heard from a domestic violence expert and most attorneys have never worked with a domestic violence expert. So, you know, we can have more conversations with attorneys to say, here's what we need to do in order to advocate better for victims of domestic violence and their children because their voices are not being heard in custody courts. They're being drowned out by shared parenting ideologies that are not appropriate. They're being drowned out by abusive fathers who have a lot of money and have very aggressive attorneys. They're being drowned out by a lot of things. And so we need to have more conversations around how we can bring people into these cases like experts, like advocates, like people who understand domestic violence and make it more of a normal process than it is now.
Absolutely. Thank you. And there is obviously, and for very, very good reasons, a lot of questions around custody courts. But I think this is a fantastic question, particularly because that given in the context, a lot of the anti-smoking prevention began with those companies being held liable in court. Are there any movements you are aware of that are addressing judicial immunity and quasi-judicial immunity of court personnel, such as guardians ad litem, that could create a similar liability for bad actors within the legal system?
Okay, I mean, in some ways, that's a technical question. Um, with respect to judicial immunity, I've heard constantly there's no accountability for judges, which is all too true. The problem is if you took away judicial immunity, who do you think would be suing them most? It would be abusive fathers because they have more money and more resources. So that probably would make things worse. There's certainly no need for immunity for evaluators or jails or people like that. Um, I think a big part of this, the two best tools for the custody courts are ACE and Saunders. Without ACE, courts minimize the harm from domestic violence and child abuse. Without Saunders, they're relying on the wrong professionals, and so they don't recognize domestic violence when they should. They're not using the best tools. Saunders recommends a multidisciplinary approach that would include a DV expert. But as Veronica said, most of the time when we're talking to attorneys, they're not used to working with domestic violence experts. We provide a specialized body of knowledge that none of the other professionals have. And if you use best practices, courts would get it right, much more often. I know some of the people in the movement are excited about some of the hearings that have been taking place, particularly in Arizona. We're actually been speaking with a judge who's part of the Supreme Court committee that's looking into reforms. And I know there's been legislature, doing hearings. They both did really wonderful hearings listening to protective mothers. I hope there will be some results. Is if we could get a couple of states to do the right thing, it would really make a difference. It was really heartbreaking. New York came really close to passing Kira's law. Kira's mother, Jacqueline Franchetti, did a yeoman's work, and unfortunately, the speaker there blocked the vote when they had the votes to pass it. If we get one or two states doing the right things, all the other states are going to see how great it works, and it'll make a huge difference. And it's that kind of reforms that are needed.
Thank you very much. It's a super insightful answer. And I really appreciate sort of that insight and perspective into the legal system in a way that I think a lot of us don't, who don't work so deeply into it, don't have the experience with it yet. So thank you so much. And we are really excited for the next two webinars. I see a lot of questions about signups for those webinars. And yes, we will absolutely be emailing out an announcement just like we usually do. You'll get a link to the registration in your email from domesticshelters.org. If you are signed up for our mailing list, which if you're here, you probably are, but you can always sign up on domesticshelters.org. There's just a little field. All you need to do is pop your email address in. And just as a reminder, within 1 week, you will receive a certificate of attendance, a video of the recording, and a lot of other resources. So once again, Barry and Veronica, thank you so very much for taking the time today. And we are so looking forward to talking with you and hearing from you again soon. And for now, everyone have a wonderful day and we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.